Welcome to our community. Susie Thomas with you this morning. We are visiting with Darla Carlisle and Pat Warther, both representing the Alzheimer's Association. Pat, tell us where you actually work.
I work for the Tuscarawas Clinic for the Working Uninsured in Dover, Ohio.
Mm-hmm. And Darla, how about you?
I work for the Inn at Northwood Village in Dover, Ohio.
And what brought you together working for the Alzheimer's Association?
I started volunteering with the Alzheimer's Association probably about 10 to 12 years ago. And part of it came from my experience working in nursing homes. I have a long career of working in nursing homes in our area and working with people with Alzheimer's and having family members with people with Alzheimer's. So that drew me into the Alzheimer's Association to become a volunteer to try to give back and help people who are dealing with Alzheimer's disease.
You hear that so often with Cancer Society, heart disease, everything else. You experience it yourself with a family member, a loved one, and that spurs on an interest to be able to help others. Darla, did you find it the same?
Yeah, actually, I started just through my career in healthcare. So I volunteered for the Alzheimer's Memory Walk, taking residents to those walks. And I've been doing that for probably 10 years or so. And then I just joined Pat recently to help with the Alzheimer's Support Group in Dover, Ohio. So that's kind of how it developed for me.
Yes. Well, thanks for what you do. Is there something about that diagnosis of Alzheimer's that just strikes terror into the hearts of everyone? What do we know about it? Have we learned more about it? Are we able to do something about it?
We continue to learn more about it with the help and assistance of the Alzheimer's Association. They do a great job of using some of the funds that we raise for research. So they continue to work on research to help us understand a little bit more about Alzheimer's and hopefully come up with a cure. As of now, there is no cure. So when that individual gets that diagnosis of you have Alzheimer's, it's really a long death sentence. It's a losing of your abilities and memory over a period of time. And that's different for every person. And each family experiences that in a different way.
We see more commercials talking about medicine to delay symptoms and help out. What do we know about these? Are we making some headway there?
We actually have some really interesting facts. And so Alzheimer's disease is the sixth leading cause of death in the U.S., the only cause in the top 10 with no method of prevention, treatment, or slowing it down. So a really scary diagnosis for folks going through that.
Yes.
In Ohio, 210,000 people are living with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia. And for each person living with this disease, 2 to 3 loved ones are providing unpaid care as caregivers. In Ohio, 597,000 caregivers providing 608 million hours of care. The numbers are just staggering.
It really is. Why would losing your memory be a death sentence? What's the correlation there?
I really think because you're losing that your sense of being and your sense of purpose, and the family members around you are losing bits and pieces of you over time. So you still have that person with you physically for that 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, however long that process is for that individual, but they lose their personality. They don't remember events. They may not remember their spouse. So the spouse continues to care for that individual, continues to care and love for that individual, and receives none of that care and love back because that person may not even know who they are. So, we sometimes call it a slow death because you lose bits and pieces of that person. They're still physically here, but they're not the same person.
When a person dies of Alzheimer's, are there other parts of the body shutting down at the same time other than the mind?
Yes, typically, and again, it depends upon each individual, but typically they die from complications related to Alzheimer's. So maybe if their swallowing ability starts to decline, and that's typical, they may die from some pneumonia from an aspiration. As they age, it may be other issues of aging that they die from, heart disease or a stroke or something like that. So they're continuing to lose their mental facilities, but then they're also aging.
Is there a difference between dementia and Alzheimer's, or is one a form of the other? What's the correlation there?
There are different types of dementia, and it's interesting. I started in this industry 19 years ago. Back then, diagnosis was Alzheimer's type dementia. It's kind of how they coined it all. It's either dementia or Alzheimer's type. Today, now we're seeing different forms of dementia. You have the Alzheimer's, that you have frontal lobe dementia, you have Lewy body disease, and they're kind of getting a little bit better at diagnosing which form of dementia there is. But dementia is kind of a catch-all for these different types of diseases that you're diagnosed with that affects the memory.
We are told that we only use a very small fraction of our brain. If a person were to get this diagnosis, is there any way that they can maybe wake up and start to use another part of the brain? Do we know that?
That's really hard to tell because with dementia or Alzheimer's, it affects different parts of the brain. Again, it goes back to what's causing the dementia. If it's a lack of blood flow to the brain, it depends upon what area of the brain's affected. If it's related to Alzheimer's, where they have plaques and tangles in the brain, again, it depends upon what area of the brain is affected. So that's why you'll see differences in people with Alzheimer's. Some people might be more aggressive because that's the area of the brain that's affected.
Wow.
Some may lose speaking ability where others don't. So it really just depends upon the area of the brain that's affected. It would be great to be able to open it up and see and know.
Say, okay, I'll just use
Unfortunately, we
this
can't
part.
do that. Unfortunately, even with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, we really aren't sure unless after the person expires, they do an autopsy, and at that point they can see those plaques and tangles that are specific to Alzheimer's disease.
Do they look alike from one person to another? Or is it very unique to the individual?
Everybody is different. It affects them differently. So you can't, it's not really a disease that you can say, well, this is going to happen today, and in a year you're going to be like this, and in a year you're going to be like that. And everybody goes through these phases. Some progress through the disease more quickly. Some, as Pat mentioned, it'll affect different parts of the brain, so it affects different parts of your personality and the way you react or act from the disease.
What about prevention? Are there things we can do in our lifestyle? I've heard don't use aluminum foil, different crazy things like that. Is there anything that we can do to help stave it off or prevent it in any way?
Well, you can keep your brain healthy.
Yeah.
We don't often talk about that. We talk about, physical health and things that we do to keep our heart healthy and other parts of our body healthy, but we don't often talk about brain health. You've probably read and heard a lot in the news lately about people with concussions.
Yes.
And those individuals do usually end up with some sort of a dementia because of the brain injury. So there is some brain health things that are helpful. It doesn't obviously guarantee that you won't get Alzheimer's, but individuals that have had recurrent concussions, you see that a lot in some of the NFL players. A lot of them have a dementia. So injury to the brain, toxins to the brain, medications, sometimes alcohol, some of those things can cause some injury to the brain, which may lead to a dementia. So things you can do to keep your brain healthy, we don't often think of, but could be helpful.
What are good things to keep our brains healthy?
I would say eating well, just making good choices. So, you don't want to drink excessively and, the types of things that would harm your body in general, living a healthy, solid lifestyle, staying active, trivia, working your mind, things of that nature.
I had an aunt who lived to be 103. She had been a geometry teacher all of her life at Maslin High School. And she was as sharp as a tack. To visit with her was like getting treated to a trip back in time because she was able to remember such detail, everything about it. And when you think about it, the years that she spanned, it really was like a history lesson standing there with someone who'd been there. And she attributed her great mind to the fact that she had done math all of her life. should we, those of us who are not prone to enjoy math, try to do more math? Or are there other fun games, mental games, do you
I
suggest?
think the old adage, use it or lose it, applies. And you can use it by using math. You can maybe read, do geometry, work puzzles, trivia, and maybe just engaging in intellectual conversation with others, just making sure that you're working your brain, staying active. And
Candy Crush? Please say Candy Crush.
maybe, I'm not sure.
A little repetitive, maybe.
Yeah.
Too much of a challenge.
Words with Friends. Okay.
It depends. You can put a twist on it and make it a more challenging, strategic game. Yes.
Okay. Well, as you were saying, words and using words and engaging in conversation, that use it or lose it. I know folks who had, oh my goodness, they were just incredible, and that was what they lost, was the vocabulary and the ability to carry on conversations. Are you saying the more we do it, the better we are at maybe keeping that part of the brain exercised?
You know, I don't know that there's any solid proof behind that.
But I want there to be. I want you to have an answer.
Some of
here.
it, I think, is genetic. Some of it is environmental. I mean,
Yes.
there are so many factors that affect the way a person ages, and there's no. I mean, I guess if we knew the answer to that, we would all be healthy and living to be 100 and living healthy to be 100. But you know, you do the best you can as
Okay.
you age.
All right, so there's some good news, but not that much good news. So let's say somebody gets diagnosis of Alzheimer's. What then? Because it really seems to be something that the entire family goes through together, or everyone in this person's life goes through this together. And before we even get there, let's talk about the age, because I know people in their 40s who have had Alzheimer's. Is there an age that you become more prone to it?
Not really an age you become more prone to it. The incidence for Alzheimer's rises greatly after the age of 80. People that are younger may have what's called an early onset dementia, and that has been diagnosed in people as early as in their 20s and 30s.
20s and 30s?
Yes. We've had, in my experience working in the healthcare field, have known several individuals that they have been in their 40s and 50s. That's early. And that's a huge then stress and change of life for that person and their family.
And would that have been someone who did have concussions or some type of brain injury early on? Do we know?
No, in the one individual that I'm thinking of, her mother also had an early onset dementia. So in that case, it was probably more
Genetic.
hereditary, genetic. A couple other individuals that I've known that have had early onset dementia, they've been the only one in the family to have it. Nothing specific that they could think of might have triggered that.
In our second half, we're really going to be focusing on the caregiver, but let's talk about the person themselves. They get this diagnosis of Alzheimer's. How do you live with it? How do you live with Alzheimer's?
You know, it's so hard. I think in the beginning, and we see this all the time, like family members sometimes don't even realize that their loved one is experiencing these memory losses. The individual, we recently had a resident come into our assisted living who was diagnosed with the Alzheimer's diagnosis, and she would one day say, okay, I'm going to write these notes because I've been diagnosed with this, but I think I can still do these things. And we were, supporting her and helping her. But then she'd come back the next day and she'd be like, I don't think there's anything wrong with me. I think they got it wrong. So there's that struggle, and your mind is fighting itself, especially earlier in the disease of, do I really have this or do I not? I don't think I do. I think I'm okay. So what, I forget something. So it's a process. It's not easy. It's not easy for the caregiver. It's not easy for the resident. I can't imagine being told you have Alzheimer's, you're going to lose your memory, and then trying to fight that every day and hang on to as much life as you can. And there's a great documentary, and I cannot, Pat, do you remember the name of the documentary? Was it Lisa Gibbons? Is that who had her mother?
I forget.
There's
Maybe
a
we could
documentary online. If you Google it, you might be able to find it. But it's just a
Alzheimer's
great story about
documentary.
a person who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and lived and documented and publicized that so that people could see that
What
story.
a brave thing to do.
Yeah, very enlightening and very helpful for a lot of people who are going through that.
All right, we all have our moments. Oh, I'm looking at the clock. I got my next question I'm going to save for after the break. We're speaking with Darla Carlisle, Pat Ward. They're talking about the Alzheimer's Association and what we can do for the caregiver. We'll have more after these words. You're listening to Our Community.